Keir Starmer just called his budget a moment of personal pride, and Julia Hartley-Brewer absolutely lost her mind live on air in what can only be described as a thermonuclear meltdown of journalistic fury. We're talking full-blown, unfiltered rage where the Talktv presenter essentially told the Prime Minister to sack himself and stop making speeches because apparently running the country is too much to ask. But before we proceed, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button for more updates on the UK political insight. Thank you. This wasn't your standard political criticism, this was a verbal flamethrower aimed directly at Downing Street, and honestly, it might be the most entertaining thing to happen on British television since someone accidentally wandered into shot during a live BBC broadcast. Welcome to UK Political Insight, where today we're breaking down the moment a breakfast show turned into a therapy session for everyone frustrated with the current government. And trust me, there's a lot to unpack here. So, let's set the scene. This morning, Keir Starmer delivered yet another speech because if there's one thing this government loves more than controversial policy decisions, it's speeches about controversial policy decisions. He was talking about growth and welfare reforms, which sounds productive, until you realize he was immediately bombarded with questions about Rachel Reeves' budget disaster that's still hanging over the government like a particularly stubborn rain cloud. And here's where it gets properly spicy. When asked about whether the Chancellor misled the public over the state of public finances, Starmer didn't just deny it, he went full defensive mode and called the budget a moment of personal pride. Let that sink in for a second. The budget that's been universally panned, that allegedly relied on a fictional black hole, that hit farmers and pensioners and businesses, that budget was apparently a moment of personal pride for the Prime Minister. It's like someone burning dinner and then proudly displaying the charred remains as their culinary masterpiece. Julia Hartley-Brewer heard this and something inside her just snapped. She started her response reasonably enough, asking if Keir Starmer could just stop making speeches and actually run the country, but then it escalated faster than petrol prices during a supply crisis. She shouted at the camera about how he put taxes up and spent more on welfare for families who have too many kids they can't afford, and questioned how on earth that could be a moment of pride. Now, the welfare comment about families is obviously controversial, and we can debate the merits of that particular argument all day, but what's undeniable is the sheer raw frustration pouring out of this broadcast. This wasn't scripted outrage, this was genuine exasperation with what she clearly sees as a government that's all talk and no effective action. Then came the absolute zinger. Starmer had said in his speech that he doesn't want to see a country where children grow up in poverty, which is a fairly standard political platitude that everyone agrees with. Julia's response, "Neither do I. That's why I tell the parents to get a siding job like the rest of us do to feed our siding kids." Again, controversial take that many will disagree with, but the delivery was pure, unfiltered morning television gold. She wasn't reading from auto cue or carefully measuring her words. She was venting like someone who's reached their absolute limit with political spin and wants actual solutions instead of sound bites. It's the equivalent of your mate at the pub who's had enough and just starts letting rip about everything that's been bothering them. Except this is on national television and directed at the Prime Minister. But wait, because Julia wasn't finished. She then delivered what might be the most memorable line of the entire segment when she said, "Forget should Keir Starmer sack Rachel Reeves, Keir Starmer should sack himself and put us all out of our misery." That's not political commentary, that's a complete vote of no confidence delivered with the subtlety of a sledgehammer to a piñata. She basically told the Prime Minister his presence in office is causing national suffering and he should do everyone a favor and resign. You don't hear that level of directness very often in British media, where we usually prefer to wrap our insults in layers of politeness and understatement. This was the opposite, pure unvarnished frustration delivered at volume with emphasis. The frustration about speeches versus action is particularly interesting because it taps into a broader criticism of Starmer's government. Since taking office, there have been a lot of speeches, a lot of announcements, a lot of promises about what's coming, but when it comes to tangible results that people can actually feel in their daily lives, the delivery has been questionable at best. Julia absolutely hammered this point home when she said, "Stop telling us the things you're going to do and actually do them because you never actually do them." That's a devastating critique because it suggests the entire government is performative rather than practical, more concerned with optics than outcomes. And then she twisted the knife by pointing out that Starmer says he's going to reform welfare, but just put welfare spending up by £16 billion. That's pointing out a direct contradiction between what's being said and what's actually happening, which is basically calling the Prime Minister out for talking nonsense. Now, let's look at what Starmer actually said that triggered this response, because context matters. When pressed about whether Rachel Reeves misled the public, he went into this whole explanation about how there was no misleading and how the OBR productivity review meant they had $16 billion less than they would have had otherwise. This is the defense, that even though the black hole narrative has been questioned, they genuinely had less money to work with than expected. He said there was no pretending it was a good starting point, which is meant to justify the difficult decisions they made. Then he added this interesting detail about how at one point they thought they'd have to breach their manifesto to achieve their goals, but later found a way to avoid that. This is meant to sound like responsible government. We kept our promises and made tough choices. But to critics like Julia, it sounds like excuse-making and justification for policies that are hurting people. The manifesto comment is particularly revealing because it suggests the government was genuinely considering breaking election promises, but decided against it. That's supposed to make us grateful they kept their word, but it also raises questions about how close they came to backtracking on commitments they made to voters. It's like someone telling you they thought about stealing your lunch but decided not to, and expecting praise for their restraint. Sure, you didn't steal the lunch, but the fact that you seriously considered it doesn't exactly inspire confidence. Starmer framed this as a positive, given the choice we didn't breach the manifesto, but it can also be just as easily framed as evidence they were willing to contemplate breaking promises until it became politically inconvenient. What's fascinating about Julia's meltdown is how it reflects a broader sentiment that's building across parts of the media and public. There's a growing frustration with what many see as a government that overpromised and underdelivered, that blamed the previous administration for everything while struggling to offer solutions of their own. The honeymoon period for Labour after taking office was remarkably short, and now we're seeing increasingly sharp criticism from all directions. When broadcast journalists start openly telling the Prime Minister to sack himself on morning television, that's a sign that patience is wearing very thin, and the usual rules of political discourse are being abandoned in favor of blunt truth-telling. The welfare spending point Julia raised is worth examining because it gets at the heart of a political divide. The government has increased welfare spending while also talking about welfare reform, which seems contradictory. From Labour's perspective, this investment is necessary to support vulnerable people and prevent children growing up in poverty, which is a moral imperative. From critics' perspective, this is throwing money at a broken system without fixing the underlying issues, potentially creating dependency rather than opportunity. Both sides have valid arguments, but Julia's frustration stems from what she sees as the government spending more while claiming they're fixing problems, which looks like making things worse while pretending to improve them. The personal pride comment from Starmer is genuinely baffling to his critics because the budget has been so controversial. Tax hikes hit businesses and individuals, farmers faced inheritance tax changes that sparked protests, pensioners lost winter fuel payments, national insurance increases worried employers. None of this has been popular, so when Starmer calls it a moment of personal pride, it sounds either tone-deaf or like he's operating in a completely different reality from everyone else. Maybe he's proud of making difficult decisions regardless of popularity, or proud of maintaining fiscal responsibility as he sees it, but the optics are terrible. It's like someone burning dinner and then proudly displaying the charred remains as their culinary masterpiece. Julia Hartley-Brewer demand that Starmer actually run the country rather than making speeches hits on something genuinely important. Governance requires more than communication. It requires effective policy implementation, adaptation to challenges, and delivering tangible improvements to people's lives. If the public perception is that you're all talk and no action, that's a credibility crisis that speeches ironically can't solve. You need results, and if those results aren't forthcoming, the frustration builds until you get moments like this where broadcasters essentially give up on polite critique and just shout what they're really thinking at the camera. The comparison to Rachel Reeves is also telling. There's been significant speculation about whether the Chancellor should resign or be sacked following the budget fallout and the black hole controversy. Julia's point was that focusing on whether she should go is missing the bigger picture. If anyone should go, it's Starmer himself, because the problems go beyond one minister or one budget. There's systematic issues with how the government is operating and communicating. That's a much more fundamental criticism than just saying the Chancellor messed up. It's saying the entire leadership is the problem. What happens next is genuinely uncertain. Will this kind of media criticism gain traction and create genuine pressure on Starmer's position? Probably not in the short term. Governments with large majorities don't fall because of broadcaster rants, no matter how passionate, but it's an indicator of mood, a sign that the government is losing the narrative battle and struggling to maintain public confidence. If Julia Hartley-Brewer is this frustrated on morning television, you can bet there are millions of voters feeling similarly. The question is whether Labour can turn things around with actual policy successes, or whether we're watching the beginning of a long, difficult parliament where the government spends most of its time defending itself rather than implementing its vision.